know this meeting is being webcast and recorded, so when you come to the... Are you sending Morse code out to the ship again, Janine? They've got cell phones out there. Somebody's got a high-powered cell phone? I'm going to lecture to them about the cell phone in just a second. So. Anyhow, when you come to the podium, if you would, please identify yourself and whom it is you're representing. And for Ms. Townsend's benefit and mine, if you would turn off all of your electronic devices, I would appreciate it very much. Thank you. With that, we have a presentation of a Sustained Superior Accomplishment Award. Mr. Kerrigan, would you like to come forward and make your presentation, sir?
Are you in control of this mic?
Before Chris starts, for all of you that think state government's just a bunch of wasteful, useless people that don't ever look into the things we do or money we put out or the people we regulate, I want you to listen to this award that Chris is going to give, because we've had one facet of our realm of responsibility that has been subject to a little bit of abuse over the years, and if you're one of those that have abused the underground tank fund, you'll probably get to know Mr. Kerrigan and his associates here in the very near future. With that, Mr. Kerrigan.
I used to say nobody wants to call me unless they have a really serious problem that they can't solve on their own and have to pay a bunch of money to solve. But that's before I went into state service, and now it's just nobody ever wants to call me. But seriously,
Chris, would you kind of either take the tall microphone and move it over towards you, or there we go. They don't work. That's one thing that doesn't work very well around here.
Seriously, though, it is my honor and great pleasure to honor 3 individuals in the UST Fraud Prevention Team pilot program that was started several years ago to ferret out fraud against the UST fund with the Sustained Superior Accomplishment Award today. This is the case number 1 team. Our pilot program team is larger, and they are also dedicated to prosecuting, ferreting out fraud and prosecuting it. This team, Karen Stripling on the left, Lola Mello in the middle, and Kim Sellards on the right, is largely responsible for the recent criminal felony filings against Kurt and Julie Hayden for defrauding the UST fund for well over $1 million. Lola and Karen were the chief staff investigators on this project. They're diligent, dedicated, they have an extreme eye for detail. They worked through thousands, actually tens of thousands of pages of documents to determine and ascertain how these unscrupulous and clever consultants have defrauded the UST fund on case number 1, which is the Hayden Environmental Inc. Case. Kim Sellards, the team leader for the pilot project, an innovator and leader, developed the system for auditing claims against the fund that is primarily the tool that we use to determine when consultants have defrauded the fund. They assisted with the execution of a search warrant at the Hayden's home, poured over tens of thousands more pages of documents to develop the evidence that led to the felony indictments of the Haydens. This is a true success story, as Chair Hoffman indicated, in state government, where we're going to get money back that was misspent or misallocated, primarily because of the fraud of unscrupulous contractors. So without further ado, I would like to present these Sustained Superior Accomplishment Awards to Karen, Lola, and Kim, and also, not insignificantly, the small cash payment in recognition of their incredibly high-level service. Thank you. Congratulations. Congratulations, and thank you.
it's nice that we have these awards, but I can tell you these people really, really deserved it. So thank you again. At this time, we have an opportunity for a public forum where a member of the public wishing to speak about a matter that's not pending before the board can do so. Do you have any cards, Ms. Townsend? Do we have any minutes that we are going to adopt here today? All of them. September 19th, October 3rd, 2012. I will move that we approve those minutes.
Second.
The second. Those in favor? Aye.
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 Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, first for the record, I'll abstain on the minutes of October 3rd.
Thank you. Do any of my colleagues have anything they would like to report?
Not for me, but I noticed in my emails that we did get our AAA bond rating from Fitch's. So congratulations.
And not a report, but a heads up for the clerk to the board that the webcast is not working.
So I can make,
Everyone talk emphatically
so
with
I
your
can make
hands.
some sarcastic remark about our bond rating as opposed to the bond rating of other portions of the state, and no one will know that I said it except for those in the room here. I'm awfully tempted to do that. You know that. I have items 3 through 6 as uncontested. Do you have any cards, Ms. Townsend, to the contrary? Anyone wishing to oppose those items? If it's great, make a motion.
And all I would note is that there was a change sheet on item number 5.
So moved.
Thank you.
And second with the change sheet?
Those in favor? Aye.
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 Any opposed? Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Howard, would you introduce item number 7, please?
Yes. Item number 7 is amendment to the Central Coast Basin Plan to establish TMDLs for fecal indicator bacteria in the Santa Maria River watershed. And we have staff from Region 3 presenting the item. I understand that Shanta Keeling will lead the presentation.
Good morning, Chair Halpin and members of the board. I'm Christopher Earls. I'm the TMDL Program Manager of the Central Coast Region.
And I'm Shanta Keeling with Region 3.
And Frances McChesney, the attorney for the regional board.
Good morning, board members. I was curious if you'd like to hear the presentation before you today. I have a couple slides. Yes? Okay. Not sure how this works. So this is agenda item number 7, total maximum daily loads for fecal indicator bacteria in the Santa Maria River watershed. Oh, and you? It is, but I'm probably talking very quietly, so. All right.
Got to lean into it.
You know what? I have already messed up the presentation. Oh, backward. Okay. This is a map of our region, of Region 3, and you can see in the yellow highlighted area, that is the Santa Maria River watershed. Here's a close-up of that map. This covers San Luis Obispo County, Santa Barbara County, and a small portion of Ventura County. The red highlights here indicate the areas that we have impairment for fecal indicator bacteria. As you can see from this map, we have a higher concentration of impairments in the lower watershed. The regulatory mechanisms that we plan on using, or that we will use to implement this TMDL, will be the domestic animal waste discharge prohibition. This TMDL will be the 6th watershed to be added to this prohibition. We will use the Phase 2 municipal stormwater permit, and we will use existing waste discharge requirements for sanitary sewer collection systems. And that was the short presentation I had before you, if anyone has any questions or would like additional information.
I have one question. What will, when we adopt our new Phase 2 stormwater permit, will that have any effect on this waiver?
On the TMDL?
Mm-hmm.
Let's see.
No, no,
Okay.
it won't.
On the comment letters I saw, there was some talk about charges of fencing off certain areas and cost per acres and what have you, but it didn't really talk about whether it was an annual cost, a one-time capital cost. When I was briefed on this on the phone by you, all of you, it didn't seem like this was going to be much of an issue and it wouldn't include a significant portion of the watershed. Could somebody touch on that so I can reconcile the question and the comment?
When there are cost estimates in the TMDL for various methods of keeping cattle away from the creek or attracting them elsewhere, it is our belief at this TMDL that fencing will be a last resort in terms of implementation. We believe landowners, if they need to implement actions, will use other less expensive methods first, such as mineral licks, providing shade, and items of that nature. And in some areas, we've actually seen improvement already, and in conversations with ranchers and other landowners, we believe that lots of landowners have already implemented many of these practices. So fencing should be a last resort.
And it was also my recollection that there were, in the upper portions of the watershed, you didn't have significant problems. Would the same criteria be required of somebody in an area where there weren't extensive hits of fecal coliform, all the while mindful of the fact that this was going to travel downstream to areas that were possibly more impacted? How would those areas that were impacted be separated from the ones that weren't, or would they all be treated the same?
Well, I imagine in our implementation, we would preferentially look at the places that are contributing more first and see how that goes in the watershed. I think we'll take it on a case-by-case basis and evaluate as we go along on the timeline.
Okay. Any other questions? It's your pleasure. Oh, excuse me, I do. Sean Haggerty. I wasn't trying to ignore you, I just wasn't in tune to.
Thank you, Chair Hoppen and members of the board. My name is Sean Haggerty. I'm a partner with the law firm of Best and Krieger, and I'm here today on behalf of the City of Santa Maria. We have a limited objection to the TMDL, but before I get to that, I do want to say that the city really appreciates the regional board's work on the TMDL. They were very responsive to many of the comments that we submitted, and other than the portions that we still have objections to, we think that the changes that the regional board made to the TMDL throughout the process were positive, and we appreciate that greatly. Our comments really focus on a somewhat narrow issue, but it's a very important issue that relates to 3 of the channels to which this TMDL applies, the Bradley and the Main and the Blosser channels. And we'd like to make 2 points about these channels that we think are very important. One, the nature of the channels themselves, in our view, don't lend themselves to being covered by the TMDL. These are engineered channels. They were constructed in or about the 1960s where no previous water course existed. In the responses to comments, there's an acknowledgement by the board that they are not natural systems, and we think that they're more akin to flood control facilities, really part of the MS4 system, and should not be covered by the TMDL. And the second point is that the regional board, in the city's view, has failed to satisfy its affirmative obligation to determine the factual accuracy of the use designation for these 3 channels. These channels are not expressly designated in the basin plan, so they're subject to the blanket or default designation for, in this case, Rec 1. When applying those types of blanket designations or tributary designations, that kind of a designation, I think the state board's previous orders and case law demonstrate that the board has an affirmative duty to assess the factual accuracy of the use designation in that case. The city has provided evidence throughout the process that these channels are fenced off, there's no trespassing signs, it's not legal to go in there and our records have demonstrated that there's no evidence of recreational use of any of these 3 channels. And despite that evidence, we think that the Regional Board has failed to conduct a reasoned and factual investigation into whether that use designation is appropriate in this case. And in response to comments that we provided, the Regional Board has said it's likely that contract recreation has occurred in this channel. They also pointed out that they're tributary to the Santa Maria River, but there's no evidence of recreational use of these 3 channels, and we think the evidence presented shows that that use does not exist and is not likely to exist. So we think this is the time when the Regional Board really has to go back and look at these use designations for these 3 channels, and think that it's really fundamentally important to do it now, because if we don't, then we're going to be locked into placing controls, spending money to try to achieve, support a use designation that's not rooted in fact. And in our view, that's inconsistent with EPA guidance on TMDLs and how they should be developed, and also state board guidance on how TMDLs should be developed. And we realize that it's a difficult process to go back and look at a use designation, and that it's time-consuming, but this is the time to do it. And we think that it's an obligation that the Regional Board has. Some of the responses to comments have sort of indicated that they don't have the resources to do that, that if the city wants to go through use attainability analysis and present it, then they would look at it. We don't think that that's appropriate either. We think it's the board's obligation to do that. We're certainly willing to partner with the Regional Board, and we've made that offer. But we're in this situation because of the use designation and the default designation that's in the basin plan, and we think that the state board's policy and the case law suggests that it is the Regional Board's obligation to conduct that analysis. So for those 2 reasons, our request to the State Board today is that you remove the Maine, the Blosser, and the Bradley from the TMDL, and that you remand the matter back to the Regional Board to conduct a factual analysis of the appropriateness of the use designation for those 3 channels.
Thank you, Mr. Haggerty.
Yeah, I'm curious if staff has any response to that.
Yeah, may I begin?
Certainly.
Okay, let me respond to some of Mr. Haggerty's comments. Our board did consider these 3 channels that Mr. Haggerty mentioned during our last triennial review, and essentially the city of Santa Maria had the same comment during our last triennial review, and at that triennial review, our board decided not to take action on these 3 channels. We feel that, actually let me back up and say that Mr. Haggerty also said that they are tributary to the Santa Maria River. The Santa Maria River has the host of beneficial uses, including the recreational beneficial use, which is of course then we have to protect that beneficial use with our bacteria standards. So even if we were to de-designate these channels, they're still tributary to the Santa Maria River, and thus they would have to still be protected and meet the standards at that confluence point. So it just isn't going to help them too much, even if they were de-designated. So one, our board decided not to take action during the last triennial review on these 3 channels, and our executive management also told our TMDL program staff that yes, we do need to protect these beneficial uses in these 3 channels. So we feel that we have clear direction not only from our board but from our executive management. With respect to accessibility, or with respect to are these beneficial uses really occurring or not, we feel that the potential of these beneficial uses are certainly there. These channels are open, and I know from my own personal experience that when I was 10 and 12 years old, I was playing in channels just like these. And when you go down to these channels, you can see evidence that children are playing in these channels.
The comment was made that they were fenced off.
I'm sorry?
The comment was made that they were fenced off.
There are portions that are fenced off. there are portions, but people still have access to these channels, and Mr. Haggerty may, of course, want to qualify that, but yes, portions are, but I don't want you to get the idea that they're completely fenced off and not accessible to the public, because that just isn't the case from my understanding. Mr. Moore.
Yeah, thank you. There was another comment Mr. Haggerty made about these channels not being natural channels originally. You know, in the San Francisco Bay region, most of the flood control channels are in formerly natural channels. I know from my technical experience. Is that the case here, or are they really truly MS4 components?
They are not natural water bodies. They were constructed in the 1960s.
Yeah, the city of Santa Maria has, well, I would say a drainage problem. And so they have had to construct channels, and they've had to construct different basins in order to address their drainage problem. And these channels are three manifestations of that problem. Again, however, the way that they've been plumbed in is that they're plumbed into the Santa Maria River. So,
is there a monitoring location specified in the TMDL evaluation that are actually in these channels, or are they downstream of the confluence in the actual Santa Maria River? Because that has a lot to do with how, you know, the TMDL will be implemented and how the data will be interpreted.
yeah, I think that is a great question. And in our dialogue with the city of Santa Maria over the past few years, as we've been working on these TMDLs and also the MS4 permits, is that we feel that we could perhaps alleviate some of their concern by setting up a monitoring point at that confluence, so that the monitoring point for compliance with the TMDLs wouldn't be smack in the middle of these things, but they would be at that confluence point. So we felt that would, again, not only address the problem that as potential source to the Santa Maria River, that confluence point would be a good monitoring point. So.
And
I only bring that up
I'm
just
sorry.
because it relates to another item we have on our agenda today, you know,
Yeah.
about from the Santa Ana region.
Right.
So this is a common theme through the state. Sorry to interrupt you, Fran.
No, so in terms of expense, because that's really the point that was being made, in terms of the expense of implementing the TMDL in those three channels, is it likely that the primary expense will be this monitoring point, establishing the monitoring point, and if it is at the confluence, that would be, what else would they
Yeah.
have to spend money on
Right.
in those three channels?
At this point in time, that's a really good question. I think probably Mr. Haggerty would be in the best position to answer that, but from my understanding is that would be the expense, would be monitoring at that point. They may also, frankly, be concerned about the fact that we have recreational beneficial uses and other beneficial uses that are associated with these channels that maybe in the future, something related to their Phase 2 permit that they may have to be required to do something that would cost them some more money down the road in association with their stormwater permit. But from the standpoint of the TMDL, it seems to me that their main cost would be at that monitoring point at the confluence.
Would you like to comment on that, sir?
Yes, thank you. One, back to the, we don't think that the regional board has ever truly conducted a factual inquiry into these issues. I mean, yes, they've reasserted on numerous occasions the fact that they believe that this should stay the designation, but that's been in the absence of any evidence to support the fact that Rec 1 use exists in these three channels. So I don't dispute the fact that when we have made this comment, and the response has always been the same, that we think it should stay, but it's not been, in our view, based on evidence. And the concern really is one that this use just is not appropriate use for these channels, and therefore it should be reconsidered. And we are not objecting to the TMDL as it applies to the Santa Maria River, and we're going to work to achieve the targets that are applied there. The problem is these channels are not supportive of that use, and we don't think it's appropriate from a regulatory perspective to include them. And you know, as was noted, this is a problem all over the state, and we think it has to be that when you're looking at these types of facilities, you have to conduct that analysis, because otherwise we're all going to be stuck with achieving standards in engineered water bodies that aren't supportive of the use. And so we don't think that it's appropriate way to proceed from a regulatory or a legal perspective. So.
Thank you. This last point that has been raised is a question that I had in the original presentation. I mean, if we've got it, irrespective of the fact that you may have played there when you were a child, I can remember doing things like that as well, but it's almost like we're encouraging recreational use in a channel that isn't conducive to that. I mean, if it's a concrete lined structure, it's either fenced or partially fenced, it's almost like we're setting a standard that says, yeah, it's okay to recreate here, and we hope you don't drown or get swept away because of the configuration of this man-made channel. So you know, possibly our staff has something that will alleviate my concern there, but it just seems to me like this shouldn't be included simply because it isn't very conducive to the encouragement of recreational use, although somebody may in fact use it. Somebody try and...
Yeah, I'd only comment that this is a practical problem. As the gentleman indicated, there are thousands of these channels in California with these designations because of tributary rule or past practices. And we tried to de-designate one channel around Vacaville, and I think we spent well over $1 million on that. And so the cost of us trying to do the work that would be necessary to do these de-designations far exceeds the Water Board's budget in total. And so, yeah, it's a practical problem. It's one that I wish we had a solution for, but we don't have a solution for it.
But from a standpoint of implementation, if the city were to completely restrict, and I didn't understand from your presentation, sir, whether the whole thing was posted and fenced, or it was said that portions of it were. I mean, would fencing this absolve them of the, you know, keeping people out do any good, or just?
Mr. Chair, just if I may
seems
just
like
make
they're
a,
getting roped into something, and I appreciate your comment, and now remember the channel down in Vacaville that we spent a fortune on.
I just want to make a further clarification. These aren't city-owned facilities; they're county flood control facilities, and so they manage it. And I think they are intended to be, and they are intended to be fenced, and they are posted. Is every inch of it fenced? No, that's not. There are points where you could access it, but they are posted. They're intended as flood control facilities, like flood control facilities throughout the state.
Yeah, I think I come back around.
oh, sorry.
Oh, go ahead. Well, I come back around to implementation, given, you know, that there's planning limitations that Mr. Howard's pointed out. And so in the end, you know, evaluation of recreational use where it exists would be conducted based on monitoring in those locations where the public uses the water. So you know, I see a solution insofar as the monitoring program, and we touched on it earlier, you know. Downstream of the confluence of these engineered channels, which are MS4 components, could be thought of as a pipe, you know, but they're open channel components of an MS4 system. So downstream of the confluence in the river, where we're concerned about the recreational use, that's an appropriate location, in my mind, for a TMDL evaluation point. And I was hearing from staff that that's the strategy in terms of evaluating the TMDL, is where the use occurs. Am I correct?
Almost. What our position was is that perhaps it would alleviate some concern from the standpoint of the city if we had that monitoring point not downstream of the confluence in the river, in the Santa Maria River, but actually in the channel itself right before the confluence, to gauge how much of a source those channels are to the river.
From a source characterization standpoint,
Correct.
which, like a pipe, you know,
Yes.
like an underground pipe.
Yes.
So
Yes.
then that's akin to, you know, evaluating a stormwater discharge point through an MS4, like a phase 2 permit,
Right,
and
Right.
as a source, not as evaluation with the standard.
correct, correct. So
That's
that
a key
Right.
distinction.
Right. That way, we would,
and-
we would alleviate, or at least I think that we would, we wouldn't have to go down the route of trying to de-designate and going through the sustainability analysis, so on, and that was mentioned here. Yet at the same time, I think it would give them a little bit of reprieve from having to meet those bacteria standards upstream in those channels themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And,
Okay.
and if, I mean, we appreciate that, and that's why I started with that point. The problem is we're still stuck with that use designation here, and it just is not appropriate. And it can't be that we're all locked into it merely because, you know, we started with a certain approach that was designed to be a temporary approach for how we designate certain uses, and now we're going forward with major TMDLs all over the state, and we're just going to say, well, now it's too expensive, we can't address that. So that, I think it's something that we have to deal with, and this is the time to deal with it. Otherwise, well, through the implementation plan and through working with the regional board, we may be able to get into a somewhat better situation. We're still stuck with that use designation where it doesn't belong.
I just wanted to add, since we're talking about the Vacaville matter, that in that particular case, the State Water Board and the courts have said that the beneficial use is that this, quote, default designation is the beneficial use, and in order to de-designate it, you would, in fact, have to go through the whole process of a use attainability analysis when you're dealing with Rec 1 types of uses. So I think right now that is the use, and the methodology for doing that is through the triennial review that the board said it didn't seem appropriate to de-designate them. You know, and they could certainly look at that again, but really you have that use, and the TMDL is addressing the bacteria that gets into the Santa Maria River. So I think that the idea of monitoring for that at that point would address the issue. And if the board does go back to reconsider the beneficial uses, they can collect all that evidence about, as Chris was pointing out, the evidence that there is, in fact, probably Rec 1, and just if under the Clean Water Act, if the use existed since 1975, it cannot be de-designated. So I think there was some information, you know, it certainly wasn't a full-blown study of the use, but there at least was information that the use probably does exist in the portions of these channels, and then it could not be de-designated for that use.
Yeah, in the Vacaville case, was the channel a listed water body in the basin plan? Because the commenter says that these are not listed in the basin plan, and it's a tributary rule
Yeah, the
application.
beneficial use is not listed there based on the tributary rule, but that was the case in Vacaville too, that it's based on, but you still have to de-designate them according to the Clean Water Act process. And they are considered waters of the U.S. and waters of the state, even though they're man-made channels.
I think you've correctly pointed out that we have a potential flaw in a lot of areas of similar construction and similar circumstance. I recall having this debate with Mr. Bishop one time about a similar channel in Los Angeles that did have high recreational use. It wasn't necessarily a recreational use that I would personally covet, but that doesn't mean that it wasn't being used. So I would feel that it would be more appropriate to tackle this issue not as a portion of this, but as a piece of a bigger whole. Getting back to Mr. Moore's comments, which I agree with, does the monitoring designation, are you comfortable with what has been described here as dealing with at least a portion of your problem?
We think that the way the board has addressed our comments regarding the implementation plan is beneficial. That we, you know, it started at a point where we didn't like it, but we made some clarifications in the process where we think it at least puts us in as good a position as we could be in if these uses stay. We just reiterate the reality that, you know, we view the better approach is to leave the TMDL, at least for us, in the Santa Maria River itself, and instruct the board to go back and really do a true analysis of the use designations for these 3 channels. If it comes back that you know, those uses do exist or have existed in the past, then that would be you know, something we could live with. But other than conjecture, we don't think that there's any evidence that that use has existed or is likely to exist.
Okay. Any other questions of staff on this? It's your pleasure, ladies and gentlemen.
I move we approve the amendments to the water quality control plan for the Central Coast for this item, and so moved.
I second the motion.
All those in favor? Aye.
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 Any opposed? Thank you. Thank you, staff.
Thank you.
Mr. Howard, would you introduce item number 8, please?
Now
An
you have to let me
informational item?
shake my head out from remembering all those glorious snow cones that I earned by fishing baseballs out of the channel near my house. And the fence was not that hard to climb, I just want to say.
All right, this is item number 8. It concerns the Science Advisory Panel report, providing recommendations on monitoring constituents of emerging concern in aquatic ecosystems. The panel was funded jointly by the State Water Board and the David and Lucille Packard Foundation. We have Gordon Innes will introduce the guest panelist.
Good morning, Chair Hoppin, members of the board. My name is Gordon Innes. I'm a senior engineer with the Division of Water Quality. In April 2012, a science advisory panel managed by the Southern California Coastal Water Research Project completed a report titled Monitoring Strategy for Chemicals of Emerging Concern in Aquatic Ecosystems. The panel was funded by the David and Lucille Packard Foundation and the State Water Board. Staff has prepared a summary of this report, which was included with the agenda package. Chemicals or constituents of emerging concern are constituents that are currently unregulated and include pharmaceuticals, chemicals and personal care products, flame retardants, and newly registered pesticides, among others. These chemicals pose a potential but unknown threat to aquatic ecosystems. The monitoring strategy proposed by the Science Advisory Panel would initiate an assessment of this threat. With me today is Dr. Keith Maruya, the project manager from the Southern California Coastal Water Research Project, who will present the findings from the report. After his presentation, we plan to discuss board options.
Thank you, Gordon. Mr. Chair, board members. It's my pleasure to be here to provide some. There we go. Turn it on. It's my pleasure to be here to present the panel's recommendations for monitoring of CECs in receiving waters. We originally had planned for our panel chair, Dan Schlenk, to be here. He had some travel snafus this morning, so you're basically stuck with me for the next 20 minutes. How did we get started with the receiving water side of CECs? As you know, many of you were involved with the recycled water policy and the amendment on monitoring of CECs for that application. We really wanted to take advantage, and staff saw this opportunity to retain the expertise of that recycled water panel to inform the same process for receiving waters. Same basic issues. There's a lack of science and a lot of information gaps on CECs that we discharge and how it would affect also receiving water. So the same issues are there. Back in 2009, we basically rolled that panel's expertise over into the receiving water side. We engaged the state board and staff to tell us what questions are most relevant on that receiving water, and that's how we got started on this effort. SQURP were employed as the facilitator to this process, just as we were for the recycled water panel. We engaged the stakeholder community early on and often in the process. We wanted to, again, retain that expertise. It was a great working group for the recycled water effort. Their efforts were lauded. And so we wanted to retain the core, but we realized that with the receiving waters, there was a bit of different expertise and different animal that we were addressing. So with the stakeholders, with the board staff, we recognized that expertise in marine resources was needed. We also received several comments from the community on antibiotic resistance as a concern, and we were able to address that expertise gap by adding a 7th member. We convened the panel back in January of 2010. Wrong way. Okay, so our philosophy for managing this panel was to maintain an open and transparent process, both at the front end in panel member selection. We engage the stakeholder community to comment and vet our candidates to make sure that the process and the expertise was viewed as neutral. We developed meeting agendas, and we actually engaged the community to provide as much information as possible for the panel to use. We incorporated public commentary and participation in all 6 of our meetings, and we'll see that when we get to some future slides. And again, the panel was science-based. They're experts in this field, and we wanted to maintain that science bent to their recommendations. Here's a list of the stakeholder community that we engaged, a lot of senior advisors, both in the public interest groups from the discharger community, and as well as both sides of Cal EPA, both from the board and as well as the resources side of the House. Our panel members, the top 6 were the original panel members for the recycled water effort. As I mentioned, Dan Schlenk at UC Riverside was elected chair of the eco system side of this effort. And then we added Dr. Jeff Scott, who was our marine resources expert from the NOAA lab in Charleston, South Carolina. You'll notice that many of these folks are out of state. This was intentional. We didn't want folks that were too close to the process within California to dominate this effort. So we wanted a good mix of national experts to weigh in on what we're doing here. I apologize for slides getting cut off. This is a bit of preaching to the choir. Monitoring for CECs is particularly important. There is a lack of information as well as technology to adequately address a chemical by chemical, a CEC by CEC approach. We're getting this information very rapidly, but there are just so many chemicals out there to chase that it's really a large challenge. From the monitoring side, the panel was very sensitized to the different viewpoints on what appropriate actions are. Clearly, there are a range of responses we can that we can recommend in the absence of a lot of hard data. But again, the panel fell back to the panel's charge was use the best available science to make these recommendations. The charge questions that the panel came up with, again, were very similar to what we needed to know for recycled water. In this case, the sources, however, that are tend to be managed and regulated in the receiving waters, we needed information on those primary sources, stormwater and also wastewater treated effluent discharge. Of course, number 2 is the all-important list. What is the list of CECs going to be? Associated with that is you need robust methods to measure these. So we need information on how those priority CECs are going to be measured and whether we have the appropriate sensitivity and detection limits to detect them. As important in receiving waters is we're dealing with different animals, so to speak, where we're talking about receiving water effects, so a different set of biological concerns now in in the waterways. Human health is one, but clearly ecological health is front and center. Of course, we want to weigh in on giving guidance on how, where, and what to monitor, and also give guidance on how management should respond to varying levels of these CECs in the environment. We thought that was very important. That schedule at the top, the basic schedule for this effort. Again, we kicked off in 2010 with a meeting down at SQURP where we invited the stakeholders. We invited some distinguished speakers to give everybody background where we are in the state of science, and then also let the stakeholder community weigh in on what they've been doing and what they see as the issues for CECs. The panel then held 4 working meetings in that 18-month period, pretty aggressive schedule. These were largely, I won't say closed, but they were there for the panel to do their business. And I mentioned at the end of every of those meetings, we had a mechanism for public commentary and report out, so everybody who was engaged knew what was going on. The panel released their draft recommendations earlier this year in February, put it out for 30 days of comment, and then in response to those comments, we held our final meeting in Richmond, where the panel responded to comments that they received. Based on those comments, the report was wrapped up in April this year, and my last bullet, I think, is a little bit in error. The staff has made a summary of the panel's report, which they have released. They're not recommendations. So, my bad. So let's get on to what the panel actually delivered in this report. Again, similar to what the panel did for the Recycled Water Project. They didn't just want to present a list. They gave a framework that can be used again and again as we get more information. And that framework is basically risk-based. That's the current best available science that we have is marry exposure and marry what we know about toxicology and make an informed decision. The panel applied this framework. They had to come up with a manageable number of receiving water scenarios. They came up with 3, as we see later, to run the information that we had and come up with their initial list of CECs for monitoring. Once the list was established, they went into some detail on how much information is needed, where and when we should monitor the results, in what matrices, water, air, tissue, those kinds of things. And then they came up with a process, again, because the information is rapidly changing and being accumulated, a process that is adaptive and can respond to new information. Lastly, the panel gave some pointed recommendations on where we should be headed with monitoring of CECs. Not necessarily the current paradigm is the most efficient way, so we'll talk about some of their leading recommendations on how to get past that quandary. So the first step is the risk screening framework. Pretty simple in concept. We need exposure information, which is our occurrence, or what we call measured concentrations. We have a good deal of investigative monitoring data throughout the state on CECs, both in the sources and also in the receiving waters. That is one part of the equation. The second part of the equation, step 2, is to come up with an appropriate threshold that that the panel designates as above this. Well, we start to worry and put this on the list for monitoring. And basically, we just ratio those 2 quantities to come up with what the panel called a trigger quotient. Yeah, these are not toxicity thresholds. They're, hey, we need to become worried about these, or we need to be concerned about these compounds. So let's set that threshold. And simply a ratio of 1. The compound made the list, and less than 1, we put it off to the side. I mentioned the discharge scenarios. We came up with 3 credible discharge scenarios based on our conversations with staff. Clearly, we have these effluent-dominated waterways. We talked about some of them in the previous talk. Channels down Southern California during the summer are basically all their flow is treated wastewater effluent, more than 90%. You would consider that to be a sort of a worst-case exposure scenario. Our second scenario is a coastal embayment, such as San Francisco Bay, where we've got both stormwater discharge during the wet season, as well as treated wastewater effluent being discharged continually. You do get dilution, obviously, in receiving waters such as these. Our last scenario is the offshore ocean, where in Southern California we have fairly large wastewater treatment facilities discharging hundreds of millions of gallons a day. Composite, that's a lot of wastewater going into the coastal ocean, but you also have higher dilution when you discharge in the ocean. So those three scenarios were what the panel recommended or ran their framework on. Some additional information on how the panel ran their framework. The chemical list that was assessed was limited to what we had for data. We needed data on both sides, both the exposure side and also on the toxicity side. That narrows the field a bit, and the panel acknowledged that. To impart some conservatism on the exposure side, because of the difference in the amount of data and the uncertainty with small data sets, they considered a maximum concentration. They found the maximum. They didn't consider distributions. They went with a maximum. Most of these CECs that we have data on are not your typical knockdown, drag-out compound where that results in lethality. These are endocrine disruptors, so we had to look at the literature for different effects, mostly reproductive effects, and gathered that sort of information. And the last point, again, is we can only recommend compounds at this level for where we have methods that we have certainty with, that we're confident that the results will help us make informed decisions. So here's the list. Now, certain chemicals like to be in water, so this first list are the CECs that will like to be in water. You can see they range at 3 or 4 different groups. We group them by pesticides, some consumer and commercial chemicals. You notice bisphenol A and some pharmaceuticals in there. The hormones are very potent endocrine disruptors, and that is the reason they made the list. They're not necessarily occurring in high concentrations, but their potency is so strong that even very low concentrations can be an issue. And then from the antibiotic resistant side, triclosan is an antibacterial additive in liquid soap that has seen a lot of attention, and that also made the list. Because of the dilution in the offshore ocean, these compounds were only recommended in the lower dilution scenarios. Because all CECs don't like to be in water, some are particle reactive and associate with sediments, and some actually will bioaccumulate and transfer up the food web. We considered sediments and also tissue as a monitoring matrix, and some of the compounds that the panel recommended are showing here. A lot of plasticides. There's a lot of commercial chemicals in that sediment category. PBDs, the pretty much phased out flame retardant, but with a long half-life in the environment, made the list, as well as perfluorinated compounds, which are your Scotchgard precursors and Teflon. Oops. Okay, the adaptive monitoring side of this, we realized that, again, this is a fairly dynamic process where information is becoming available. To approach this, the panel recommended that an initial phase of monitoring be done to see that their recommendations make sense, and then to recommend a tiered response based on what we see as those monitoring trigger quotients. We see high values, we leave that on or we do more action. We see very low values, perhaps we're less concerned about those compounds. And that's what we're referring to by the off-ramp here, which uses this kind of construct. Since the panel is recommending collecting that exposure and updating the threshold data, we can calculate MTQs, see where they lie on this continuum. Again, if they're very low and continue to be low in a 3 to 5 year time frame, perhaps we discount those compounds. Conversely, if we see elevated levels of that trigger quotient, we want to keep our finger on those compounds very carefully. The other side is the changing chemical landscape that we have out there. There are literally tens of thousands of chemicals, thousands come on board each year. How do we ensure that these new chemicals are not issues? And so there are a couple ways the panel recommended to have on-ramps into the system. The first is to recommend investigative monitoring for chemicals that we are developing methods for now. Perhaps they're not 100% vetted, but we're getting there. And also do special studies on the effects side, toxicity studies, to show whether there's linkage between the chemicals we are monitoring and actual adverse impacts in the water bodies. The second recommendation they made was the development of a pre-screening model where we take chemical usage information and we develop fate models, which again have been developed for certain water bodies in certain scenarios, and use this model to predict whether a class of chemicals or a certain high production volume chemical will in the future be an issue. So this is another way to get CECs into the system.
That screening you're talking about would occur in the laboratory, not, out in the environment, but you would try and pre-screen categories of products to give you an idea whether they had a reasonable potential to have problems when they're discharged, or how does that work?
Well, that is one way. In fact, that's the way people are screening individual chemicals now. Once from the receiving water side, it's perhaps a little different, where you can look for the chemical after it's discharged. So it's a little different animal. I think what you're referring to, we'll get to in a couple of slides, is on how to capture all these in a screening measurement.
Kind of a pre-screening type situation.
Right.
I think I know where you're going, so I'll be patient.
So anyway, it was important, again, for the panel to provide both off-ramps and on-ramps into the system. And it's also important why we need to revisit this periodically. So the major recommendation the panel made was, what do we do about all the CECs that we don't have methods for? We can't capture with 150 chemical screen analytically. And this was carried over from the recycled water recommendations, where we need a new model or a new way to monitor or screen for chemicals in general. This is a CEC panel, but the beauty of these bioanalytical screening tool concept is that it applies to all chemicals, not just CECs. It targets an impact. It is a response at the very low molecular level, but as you see in some future recommendations, we need to be able to tie those molecular responses to some larger impact. Clearly, if we can use these tools to screen for broad classes of chemicals, we will save time and money. And both staff and you all have seen this pre-wisdom in helping us further these tools for the recycled water side. Just a cartoon on how these tools work. Basically, you've got engineered cells, whether they're cancer cells or human breast cells or even bacterial cells. They're engineered to release a tagged or fluor compound when it's exposed to the CEC of interest. And basically, all you need is a light measure once you've exposed these cells to a water or an extractive sediment that contains these chemicals. The good news is that research has shown that bioassay responses, which are shown on the X there, lines pretty good up with what we know chemically. So a one-to-one relationship of our chemistry and our screening bioassays is something we need to know to have confidence that these assays are working. With that, the panel would like to thank the staff and also you all for the opportunity to serve in this capacity. I can say for all 7 of the panel members, they enjoyed the process and they enjoyed particularly how it's the potential for application of their work, and they're happy to serve in this capacity in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So, I'd like to jump in for a minute before we go to the cards and talk about where this leaves us. Unlike with the recycled water policy, where we asked the panel to come up and give us monitoring requirements for recycled water projects that we can put into the permits and into the policy. But we asked them to come up with the same for discharges to the environment. They came back with an intermediate step. And in essence, they said that what we need to be doing is some pilot projects and special studies over the next few years to confirm this information, that there's not good information yet to warrant including them into MPDS, essentially MPDS monitoring programs, and making them a continuous part of that program. And so they recommended a phase 2 and 3 of the project, which are intermediate to including them into the MPDS monitoring programs. And they proposed that as a special study, is the way I think they described it. Now, special studies make a lot of sense if you're a research organization. They're a little bit harder for a regulatory agency to deal with. And so one of the things that we'd like you to consider is how we would move forward with that recommendation. We have in the end of your item some potential options for funding, how we would pay for this, because that's what it comes down to, is we have to pay for it. And I'm going to run through them in a very high level way. We can do it voluntarily, ask the major dischargers if they'd like to step forward and do this in conjunction with us in a voluntary manner. That's one. We could ask the director to issue orders to have folks do this under a 13267 or 13283 orders, requiring them to conduct monitoring in this manner. We could skip that phase and just take the proposed CECs and ask the regional boards to put them into their MPDS permits and monitor them and reevaluate after a few years of monitoring. We could initiate a budget change proposal and see if we could get funding out of our whole program to see if we could get there. Or we could redirect our ambient monitoring program. Let's really cover the whole gambit of options on how we could move forward with this. I've had discussions with CASA on this issue, and we will hear from them, I think, today about their willingness or not willingness to volunteer. So I take that before we move forward. And then last